All right, we're ready for Exodus chapters 31 and 32. There's a lot of familiar ground here in these two chapters. As we work our way through, let's see where we are in our outline. We are in the tabernacle section. We're going to be finishing the design of the tabernacle, at least as it's outlined by Baxter, and move into the idea of it being delayed. So we're going to get 31 and 32 and quickly making our way toward the end of the book. Let's review a few of our chapters, and then we'll get underway with chapter 31. Chapter 1 opened the book with what? Yeah, the children of Israel suffering in Egypt. And then chapter 2, have a leader is born whose name is Moses, his birth, his early life. Chapter 3 is where God called him, yes, to be the deliverer. And then in chapter 4, he makes excuses. Chapter 5, he makes a request to Pharaoh. Things get worse. Chapter 6, we have assurance to Moses and to Israel. Now chapter 7. All right, here's Aaron's rod in the first plague. And so in chapter 8, we have the second, third, and fourth. We have the fifth and the sixth in the next chapter, and seventh, eighth, and ninth. And then we have the announcement of the 10th plague. So what happens in chapter 11? It's the actual 10th plague, the Passover and the 10th plague. Then we have the sanctified and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Chapter 14, one of the more notable chapters. That is the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea. There we have the Song of Deliverance. Then in chapter 16, what do we have? Manna from heaven. Chapter 17, water coming from the rock in chapter 17. 18, we have Jethro's advice. Chapter 19 was what? At Mount Sinai. That should say Mount instead of Mr. Sinai, but Mount Sinai and the preparation to receive the law. The 10 Commandments are in chapter 20. What happens in 21? Various laws. We have that in chapter 21, 22, and 23. And various laws concerning relationships, having to do with servants, violence, animals, etc. And then chapter 24. We have the ratification of the covenant. Yes. And Moses is called to the mount. So now Moses is going to be on the mount till our end of chapter 31 in our study this evening. So in chapter 25, we have the offering. And so this is beginning at the end of chapter 24 is where Moses has gone up on the mountain. He's going to be there for 40 days. All that takes place from chapter 25 through chapter, let's go ahead and put all of that back up here. The tabernacle, the altar, and the court of the tabernacle, etc., the garments. All of this is instructions Moses is receiving on the mount until we end our chapter 31. Make sense? So when he comes off the mount, chapter 33, he's been there since the end of chapter 24. All right, let's go to our question number 1. What's chapter 31 about? All right, the workers on the tabernacle. Who are the leaders of that? Who are the artisans? And then here is the Sabbath law. And we see the tables of stone. So all of that's going to be found there. Same question. What's chapter 32 about? The golden calf. All right. Now let's get underway here looking at chapter 31. Let's work through chapter 31. Short chapter. 3 things that happen. We have here 2 prominent workers. And let's back up just a little bit. We flagged this a couple of times already. This is not the only reference I'm about to give you, but the one I'm about to give you is not the only reference. But notice in chapter 28 and in verse 3 that there are gifted artisans. And so here are skilled workers that are to work on the making of the tabernacle, making of the cloth, making of the acacia boards, covering them and overlaying them with gold, making the sockets, making the garments for the priest, etc. This was in the context of the priest. And so here are artisans. They're not named. So now let's go to chapter 31 now, and here are two men. There seems to be a prominent man, and then for lack of a better term, his right-hand man, his predominant helper, and then there are a number of others who are unnamed. So let's see if we can see what we find here. Bezalel is the name of the first one. He's the son of Uri, the son of Hur. Hur was seen earlier. Where did we last see Hur? Not necessarily last saw him, but what's one of the prominent things we saw him do? He's holding up Moses' hands in chapter war with the Amalekites. Same place where the water came from the rock. So that's chapter 17. That's where we saw him, holding up the hands of Moses. And so he is one who is in a great supporting role. We don't see him again, to my knowledge. I may be wrong about that, but I think this is the last we see of him in our book of Exodus, at least. We may see him referenced in maybe Numbers or Deuteronomy, but I don't remember. We'll come to that later. Now, let's get ahead of ourselves and I'm going to come back to 3 and 4, but Aholiab is mentioned at verse 6, and he seems to be one who is appointed with the predominant Bezalel. And your translation, by the way, these two names are spelled different depending on your translation. So if the spelling on the board is different than yours, that's just a translation issue. We're not talking about different people. But I want to go back to verse 3. What do we know about them and their abilities? Their God-given abilities. Notice verse 3, God filled them with wisdom and understanding. One writer made the observation I thought worth considering, that quite often we see God filling someone with the Spirit of God. Usually that's with a prophecy or a revelation of some sort. But here, it's wisdom, not just in wisdom of the revelation of God, but it's wisdom to do things with their hands of a craft. Does that make sense? I don't know of another place where that kind of expression is used. There may be. I'm just not familiar with the text that uses God filling them with His Spirit so they have wisdom and understanding and knowledge of all manner of workmanship so that they could work in gold or silver and setting of jewels and etc., carving wood and various. Now, verse 6 mentions some other workers. I notice verse 6 mentions, I'll put wisdom in the hearts of all of those who are gifted. So I take it that Bezalel is the predominant man who is the leader. He has his right-hand man, much like Moses has his assistant Joshua. And then there are various others, how many I don't know, who are artisans and skilled people, because we have a big task. They've got to make all the cloth, all the wood, and cover it, etc., and then make all the articles, make all the garments, cut the jewels, the settings for the jewels. It's going to take a lot of workers to get all of that done. Now, I want to tie that with, you might make a marginal note, chapter 35, and notice at verse 31, make sure I got the right verse, verses 31 to 35, that there's something mentioned here that's not mentioned in our text about these same men. That God put His Spirit in them, and I'll notice at verse 34, He has put in his heart, that is Bezalel, put it in his heart, the ability to teach. Now, in the context, I take that to mean not merely that he has the ability to teach the law of God, to teach. He may have had that ability, but I think it's in the context of being a leader in, for example, one of the crafts. Maybe it's making of the cloth, or maybe the weaving of the cloth, or the cutting of the stone. He has the ability to teach so that others can be taught how to do this. Does that make sense? And so that's important to pass that on to other people for what that may be worth to us. All that they're to make is found in verses 7, 8, and 9. All right, any questions on the men, the artisans? There's some practical things to learn from that. What do you learn from that in a practical way, from verses 1 to 11? Good observation, yeah. God gave him a task, but then He gave him the tools to do it. He does the same thing for us.
He also is telling them, when you're bringing up the teaching, He's telling them that this is something that needs to be continued. The they're going to need things repaired, or they're going to need things done and accomplished, and he's laying the groundwork for that, just like he tells us to teach our children his word, and he gives us the groundwork to be able to do that.
Good point. Good point. The Lord's work, I put as one of the practical things, the Lord's work deserves people of ability and who can carefully do the work right. And rather than, it's interesting, God didn't want them to make, I take it in building the making of the golden calf was not carefully done, that was kind of a hurried work. But in the work of God, God wanted it carefully done. It's worth taking the time to do it right. Does that make sense? And that deserves in all aspects of the Lord's work. Now let's talk about the Sabbath law. Now this, on the surface, may seem like an abrupt change. We've been talking about the tabernacle and all the contents of the tabernacle and the elements of the tabernacle, the utensils, et cetera, and what's to be made of. And then coming back to a point that's already been made, then all of a sudden he said, now here's the Sabbath law. And then the chapter abruptly ends with God wrote this down on the tablets of stone, and then Moses heads down the mountain. I don't think it's an abrupt change. And there is some conjecture here, but I raised the question, why mention the Sabbath law here? Perhaps it's in the context of all the work that's to be done in the building of the tabernacle, making of the garments, making of the utensils, making of the furnishings, that even though that work is important and there's a great deal of work to be done, that's not to interfere with their Sabbath observance. Can you not see that there may be someone who would think, if they're going so far to have idol worship, that they also could say, this is important for us to build the tabernacle. We're not quite through, and I know tomorrow's the Sabbath, but we got to keep working. We got to get this done. And God said, no. There is an importance here concerning worship. There's a lesson for us in that. There's something very practical. No matter, even if it's the work of the Lord you're doing in some other area to the neglect of the day of worship, God didn't think much of that. Does that make sense? All right.
That kind of addresses this in the New Testament, not the same way, but when he says, you don't say you're taking your money and giving it to the Lord so you can't help your parents. One thing that God says doesn't negate the other things that God says.
All right. Let's look at this Sabbath law, verses 12 to 17. What do you see in this? First, let's look at verse 13. This is my Sabbath. That's interesting. God calls it his Sabbath. This is my Sabbath that you shall keep. And let's look at this phrase, for it shall be a sign between me and you throughout the generations, that you may know that I'm the Lord who sanctifies you. Now, there's something about observing the Sabbath. Every time the Sabbath rolls around, there's some connection with doing that. You say, well, why do we do that? Well, we do that because God said so. Okay, but there's another, God had a reason for you doing that and for saying so. What was it? Well, that you may know that I'm the Lord who sanctifies you. You think that's saying that lest you forget God? That if you observe the Sabbath, you're remembering the Sabbath day, you're keeping it holy, and you do that again, 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 and do that again, that you're less likely to forget God than if you do have some Sabbaths you don't observe, and you have a number of Sabbaths you miss, but every once in a while you hit one of those Sabbaths, you think you're more likely to forget God? I think so. I think that's what he's saying. Now, what else do we learn, 14 and 15? We're going to flag some practical things we learn here, but what's the point of the section?
He says it's only for you. He's not saying you do this because it's important to them. This is what you're doing because you need it.
All right, it is important for them. Look at verse 14. Anyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. In other words, God's pretty severe about that. God's pretty serious. You profane it. What does the word profane suggest to you? Look at your footnote, if you have one. Verse 14, if you defile it. In other words, make common use of the Sabbath. I work on the Sabbath. Instead of observing the Sabbath, I've profaned it, I've defiled it, you're going to be put to death. Now, the reason for that is, verse 15, that work shall be done 6 days, on the seventh is a Sabbath of rest. We'll come back to that in a second. What's the parallel that's given? Verse 17. The creation week. Yes, very good. The creation week. That the creation was made in 6 days and God rested on the seventh and was refreshed. How and in what sense God was refreshed? I forgot which commentator it was, says, I think we need to leave that alone. I don't know what to say, he said, about that. Probably not a bad idea. I'm not sure in what sense God was refreshed. I know God rested. In other words, he wasn't working. But in what sense was God refreshed? The text says he was, but beyond that, it doesn't tell me much more. And I'm going to leave it at that. Now, let's go back and look at a couple of things. One is, for what it may be worth, to answer a couple of errors that are taught in our current day. Many say, and you've heard this many times before, that the Sabbath, for example, people talk about the Lord's Day, the Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. The Sabbath is the seventh day, not the first day. And evidence of that, verse 15. But the seventh is the Sabbath of rest. The Sabbath is always on the seventh. It's not the first day of the week. That's one thing. That's not as big a deal as the next point I wanted you to see. And we have a question on that. And question number 4, what do you see in this text? It tells us that the days of creation were not, number 1, millions of years in length or separated by millions of years. What do you see there? All right. Exactly. Wouldn't make it. Yeah, the comparison is made between the work week of 6 days and resting on the seventh and compares the creation day as being parallel to that. Wouldn't make much sense if those days were millions of years or separated by millions of years. So there's a comparison. If the days are literal 7 days in the work week, then the literal 7 days in creation week. Another thing I want to flag for you is the fact that verse 17, you might circle or underline the heavens and the earth. Some of the theistic evolution talks about God created, evolution only involves the, not the inanimate, but the animate part of creation. And yet God created the heavens and the earth, the animate and the inanimate, in 6 days. Does that make sense? All was created within those 6 days, period. All right, let's move on to the tablets of stone, or the tables of stone in verse 18. God had finished speaking. Now this started in chapter 24, the end of chapter 24. This is that 40-day period that he's on the mountain, and this is the revelation he's received. And having received it, and more of the details of that's going to be given elsewhere. We get into Leviticus, we get more of the details. But he wrote the tablets of stone, and there were 2 tablets of stone, and they were written with the finger of God. Look at verse, if you want to tie some verses together from chapter 31 to chapter 32, look over at verse 16 of chapter 32, and might tag that as a connecting verse, that the tablets were the work of God, written was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. Let's talk about that phrase, the finger of God. It's used only about 4 times in the Bible. Remember in Exodus 8 and in verse 19, the Egyptians, looking at the things God was doing, said, "This is the finger of God." What they mean by that is it just simply means by God's power, by God's supernatural power. It may have reference as if, now God doesn't have a literal physical finger because God is a spirit. But it may have reference to God doing something as you may do it with your finger, but it really is an expression of God's power. They said this is the finger of God, meaning it's God's power. Another reference is in Deuteronomy 9 and in verse 10. Same concept, the power of God. And Luke chapter 11, one time in the New Testament, the expression is again concerning the power of God. Luke 11 and in verse 20. It's just a statement of God's power. So one of the questions is, did God actually do the engraving onto the stone? I take that he did. Others have thought that he may have had Moses to do the engraving on the stone, and it's the message and the writing that is the power of God. Okay, I'm fine with that. I don't see anything in the context that would violate that. But I take verse 16 of 32, and you take 18 of 31. Perhaps that does suggest God did the actual writing on the stone. Now let's get on into the golden calf, chapter 32, because we got some ground to cover there. Let's talk about Aaron and the people made a golden calf. And what we know about it, I want to drive, I'm driving to verse 6 because there's a point to be made at verse 6. And then there's some difficulties at the end of the chapter I want to have some time for. If you've worked out all those difficulties, then be ready to explain all that for us, because I hadn't got all the difficulties worked out fully. But anyway, we'll get to those. Let's look at verses 1 to 6 quickly, because this is very familiar territory. What we have is that Moses was delayed. I don't take that to mean that he was longer than God intended, but delayed in the eyes of the people. So what did they do? Where'd they go, and what'd they say? Yeah, come and make us gods. They made the request. Now, some commentators, and I think Barnes may be one. Don't quote me on that, but I think he may be one that does this. That takes the verse 2 as evidence that Aaron tried to push back on that, thinking they wouldn't want, and I don't see any evidence of this, but I'm going to throw this out for what it's worth to you, that Aaron was thinking, and I'm going to just paraphrase the concept, that Aaron was thinking that you wouldn't want to part with your earrings and your precious jewels, so I'll put a stop to this by asking you bring all your gold earrings to me, break them off and bring them to me, and we'll make the calf. And all right, they did it. Well, that's not how he should have dealt with that if that was what he was doing. I don't take it. I think he's part of the plan here. I want you to keep this in mind, which we already know. These are the very people who have witnessed the parting of the Red Sea. They have witnessed manna fall from heaven. They've witnessed quail fall from heaven, and they've witnessed water coming from a rock. And they've only been without Moses for how long? 40 days. And they gave up on him, and they want to make a god, and gods, in fact. And so what did Aaron do with it? He took it and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molten calf. It means he melted the gold and shaped it into a calf. I think evidence a little bit later may suggest, and I can't prove it 100%, but that the calf probably was much like other things that they made, may have been made out of wood and then overlaid with gold, and with molten gold. Evidence? Well, when they burn it and take the ashes of that and spread it upon the water. They ground it up and have made it into powder. May give us some evidence of that. I'll pass it for what that's worth to you. All right, I want you to notice though at verse 6, I'm sorry. I'm still sorry. Verse 4, I'll get it right in a second. That Aaron said, "This is your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt." Aaron knew better than that. Aaron knows better than that. He knows that's not true. And then he proclaims a fast. Now, verse 5, some think that he's saying, let's proclaim a fast to the Lord, this new God. But I take it that either he's thinking this is representative of the one God, some visible sign of God that you have. And I take it that he's trying to sacrifice and make a proclamation to the one true living God. And what's his motive here? I'm not sure. Is he trying to sacrifice to this God? Others think maybe, and I think they may have something going there, that in spite of this idolatry, if we sacrifice to the one true living God, maybe that appeases the God of heaven. I think Aaron knows better. Look at verse 6. I'm driving to this point. They rose up early the next day and offered a burnt offering and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink, and they rose up to play. You might highlight that or underline that. That is quoted, by the way, in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. 1 Corinthians 10, rather, and in verse 7. Now, for what it's worth to us, that expression, the people sit down to eat and drink and rose up to play, may refer to sexual immorality because it's often associated with immorality. And here's some evidence of that. The New International says that after they sat down to eat, they got up and indulged in revelry. The New Century said they sinned sexually. Verse 25, let's get ahead of ourselves. Verse 25, your translation may say they were unrestrained. The King James says they were naked. Well, that would seem to fit. And let me give you one more evidence. 1 Corinthians 10:7, where this is quoted, people rose up to, sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. The very next statement talks about sexual immorality, verse 8. So does it involve sexual immorality? I take that it does. It was often associated with idolatry. Just, for what it's worth, those of you who have copies of this or get copies of this, I'm not going to read all of this, but this is pulpit commentary. They talk about this was probably an orgy that was often associated with idol worship. And so if you can get the picture, and then other commentators say the same thing. This is from Mangum and Brown. They make the same point that probably this suggests some sexual connotation. That's how it's used. The same word is used in Genesis 26 of caressing or sporting. Here's another, Freeman and Chadwick say the same thing. Probably a drunken orgy, as the UBS Handbook Series argues. So get the picture now. How long? Moses has been gone for 40 days, and not only have they created an idol, they have a drunken orgy. They have this sexual activity going on around this idol. Does that make sense? Now, others suggest that maybe it just simply means they were having fun around that. Revelry, it means to revel. That may be what's going on. There was dancing and going on. Some say it just means they were playing, but it well fits with this concept of a drunken sexual promiscuity going on, as often went on with idolatry. Now, think how disgusting that is to God, of what they're doing, if that be the case. Either way, they're doing whatever they want to do. If they want an idol, they had an idol. If they were wanting to commit sexual immorality, they would have done that too if they didn't. Only thing keeping them from doing it is they just didn't want to do that, if that be the case. All right, does that make sense? Now let's look at God's reaction to that now. God's wrath is stirred. God said they are corrupt. Verse 7. Same word is translated in Nahum 2 and verse 2 is ruined. They've ruined themselves. They're destroyed. Same word is destroying the world by a flood, Genesis 6:13, 9 and verse 11. Let's flag another thing at verse 11. What about a timing issue? Verse 8, what did God say? They have quickly turned aside. This didn't take years. They quickly turned aside. They forgot about God. They forgot about Moses. They forgot about his law. They forgot about what God has done for them with less than 40 days. Let's look at verse 9. God is telling Moses what's going on. Keep in mind, Moses is not seeing this. He's only hearing about it. God sees what's going on. And we're going to see Moses' reaction in a second. And they're saying, this is your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said, these are stiff-necked people. What does that mean, they're stiff-necked? Stubborn. Absolutely stubborn. Is that what the English Standard says? I think it may use the word stubborn. They're stiff-necked, or they're stubborn people. In other words, the idea of being stiff-necked, if you ever rode a horse that's stiff-necked, that means you're trying to get him turned, and he's determined, I'm not bowing my neck, I'm not turning. That's stubborn. I'm not giving. I'm not going to give. I'm not going to do what you want me to do. And we're often that way. They were that way. I want you to turn this direction, and man is stiff-necked. I'm not going the direction that God goes. All right, let's talk about Moses' reaction now. He pleads with God. There's a couple of things I learned here. He asked God a question. Why does your burn hot? Moses hadn't seen this yet. He's only heard about it. Do you think it may be worse if you saw it? We'll see. We'll see if it is. We'll play that out. Yes, ma'am. Yes, he does. Now, what else do you see in verses 11 to 14? All right, very good. God's ready just to wipe them out. Can you blame him? And yet Moses pleads with him and asks him, what's his major question? He mentions the promise that's been made, etc., and you brought him out of the land of Egypt. But here's the question that I'm asking God. Let's rethink this. Say again. Yeah. The very people that the strong right hand of God brought out here into the wilderness, and you destroy them, what are the Egyptians going to say? And so God did what? He relented. He changed his mind. Does God ever change his mind? Yes, he does. Yes, he does. We've already seen that back in Genesis. Remember when God was ready to destroy Sodom? Remember the pleading of Abraham? What if there's 50 right? What if there's 45? What if there's 40? What if there's 35? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? God kept changing his mind. God changes his mind here again. That doesn't mean God changes his law or God changes his character or his principle, but God may change his intent of something he planned to do, and that he did. All right. Yes, ma'am.
In verse 10, it says that I may make of you a great nation. That was quite an opportunity that Moses was given a second time, because he was made great back in Egypt, and yet he turned from that, and he turns from this and argues on behalf of the Israelites, and that takes a special kind of character to be able to turn down something like that.
It does. Beginning at verse 15 now, let's talk about Moses coming off the mount. I want us to get to a couple of things and then get to some of the difficulty in the last 5 minutes or so if we can. He comes down off the mountain and he broke the tables of stone. But now notice at verse 16, you might flag chapter 24, verse 12, that God said, I'll give you the tables of stone and that are going to be written, and you may... they'll be engraved. And Joshua heard the noise. You might flag 24 and 13. Joshua, his assistant, went up with him. And he was there with him as they're coming off the mountain. And he heard a noise. He heard shouting. And yet Joshua reasoned, the noise I'm hearing is not the voice of victory like a war, nor is it the cry of those in defeat. I hear singing. And then they come on down and they saw dancing, the calf and the dancing. Perhaps that was lewdness. So Moses' anger became hot. That's interesting. Remember him asking God, why is your anger hot? God was seeing it. Moses now sees it. It's a different story. And so you might flag verse 11 to verse 19 and tie those together. He now sees what God saw. His anger became so hot, he took the tablets of stone and he broke them and shattered them. And then he did a second thing, verse 20. Yeah, ground it up into powder and made the people to drink. Now, I'm more interested, not that that's unimportant, we're familiar with that. Let's look at verses 21 to 24. He rebuked Aaron and asked, what is it that the people did that caused you to bring this great sin upon them? What did Aaron do, which people often do? It's their fault. You know the people. So he shifted the blame. You know the people. But he wasn't through shifting the blame. Who else did he blame? Kind of shifted some blame to Moses. Because, by the way, and I'm going to paraphrase verse 23, says, as for this Moses, they say they don't know what become of it. By the way, you're not innocent in this, Moses. You took so long. That's why we had a problem down here. So it's the people. It's them. And then he wanted to distance himself from it. He said, I threw the gold in the fire, and out came this calf. Oh, yeah, right. First theory of evolution, I suppose, being evolved there. I just threw it in the fire, and boom, here it came. That's he's distancing himself from the sin. Now, verse 25, we need to start a new section here. The last section, Moses addresses the sin first before the people and then before God. That's the two difficult sections. Verse 25 is not difficult. You might flag that verse 25, the unrestrained, King James says naked. If our understanding of the perhaps prostitution, sexual immorality connected here of the people sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play, verse 6, then that may be correct of the idea of nakedness. That is unrestrained. But Moses asked this question, who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me. So this is part of the difficulty. And I'm going to work through two difficulties quickly and see if we can make sense. I do not think it's a situation, as some in preaching sermons on that, who's on the Lord's side and here comes some over. I think what he's saying here, there is a problem to be dealt with. Who wants to come and help in, who is not involved in this sin? Not everybody was involved, obviously. But who not being involved wants to come and stand with me in dealing with this sin. Now, exactly why only the Levites are the ones who came or mentioned, I don't know. Several conjectures of maybe because the close connection to Moses in the same family, that may be the connection. I don't know. But what's their task? He signs them a task. I want you to take a sword, go through and kill. In other words, I take these 3,000 that are killed, that there doesn't seem to be any resistance from anybody else trying to hide people. Nothing said about that. These must have been the ringleaders, I take, because they're not the only ones. How do I know they're not the only ones? Because there are more that are mentioned in verses 30 to 35. Okay? So I take these to be ringleaders. So these are executed. Now, when we take the number of 1.5 million to 2 million people, remember 660,000 is only 20 years old of fighting men and above. All right? That being the case, 3,000 is not a large number, is it? So it's not like the whole nation was given over to this idolatry, but there were 3,000 that were involved that we know of. Or why were they executed? All right? They do that. Now, verse 29, Moses said, consecrate yourselves today that he may bestow upon you a blessing. What is that blessing? I don't know. Perhaps that's the blessing of serving in the capacity of, because the revelation given up on the mount, they don't know yet. Moses knows that, but they don't know that yet because he hadn't told them what he just learned up there. God had said something about the Levites being priests and Aaron being priest, but they hadn't heard that. We heard it because we got to be up on the mountain with Moses. But they don't know. Does that make sense? They don't know that yet. You're going to have a blessing. And there was some task. I'm not sure what the task was. Literally, it's the idea of filling your hand again, verse 29. Now let's get 30 to 35. Moses then goes and pleads for the people in their sin before God. And at verse 32, he asks basically to be a substitute for them. If you can't pardon them, then mark me off, wipe me out, and let me be the substitute. And God's answer to that is, you can't be a substitute. In fact, the only substitute we know about is Christ, and he will be. And here's the evidence of that. Look at verse 33. He said, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of the book. In other words, I'm not going to blot you out for him, Ezekiel 18. I can't do that. If he's the one that sinned, I'll blot him out. I'll not blot you out because of him. Does that make sense? You're not going to be the substitute for anybody. You can't bear their sin. You can't take the punishment for them. So God said that he would punish some with a plague. Why not kill them like the rest? I take it, and there is conjecture, the others, the 3,000 must have been ringleaders, others were participants. And so there is some plague. What was the plague? When was it executed? I don't know. The text does not tell me. Let me mention two more things, our time is gone. Look at verse 35. God said, I will punish verse 34 and 35, I will visit punishment upon them because of their sin, and I'll send a plague. Perhaps that includes not making it to the promised land ultimately. That may be partly of that. But the one more thing I want to mention, why isn't Aaron? He sinned and all that. Why? Aaron's not mentioned here. 3,000 were killed and the plague comes up on others. Why not Aaron? Add this verse in the margin of your text. Deuteronomy 9 and 20. Moses had interceded for Aaron and was successful in that. He said, I pled on this occasion for Aaron. Not mentioned here, but in Deuteronomy 9 and 20 he did. That's the only explanation I have of that. Because Aaron is just as involved, just as guilty as anybody else. And yet God had pleaded with him. So I take it these are unrepentant people. Some suggest, I said one more note, I'm going to add even one more, and we got to be done. That the 3,000, as they go through the territory, finding them, some suggest look for those who are still participating in this idolatry. And that may be why they were executed and others receive a plague. That's the best I can do with that. We're going to stop. Oh, that's right. I'm looking at Sunday morning. Yeah, let's go on. Thanks, George. George wants more. I'm looking at the Sunday morning time. Yeah. All right. Any questions on that? Didn't take long to do that. What I wanted to do right there at the end, and I'm confused on my time. There's got to be a distinction in this plague and the execution of 3,000. And I don't know what to do with that other than to surmise somehow that these were involved more than these others. But whatever, the whole nation wasn't wiped out. Only 3,000. And I think there may be something to this. I wanted to go back if I had a chance, and I thought I was running out of time. The 3,000, the looking out among them, I wanted to skip verse 27 on purpose because I didn't have time. But let every man put his sword on his side and go in and out from entrance to entrance throughout the camp, and let every man kill his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. The wording of that just kind of sounds to me like you're looking for those who still participate somehow. Maybe they're still singing and dancing and praising this calf. I don't know. And that may be part of the difference that we have there. Let's go to question 10 and get 2 or 3 of these practical things. We've got a couple of minutes now. What other practical things do you learn from these chapters? Not much. Good point. Good point. Good point. I see a lesson about blaming others as Aaron did. It's not my fault, somebody else's fault. George? Good point. And I'll tell you something that occurred to me also in this, in addition to that, is he was easily persuaded, that's true. But at the same time, what Aaron doesn't know is while up on the mountain, God's made him going to make him high priest. And if I'd been in the choosing for a good high priest, I'd look at Aaron and think he's worthless. You know, there's no place for him in the kingdom of God. And yet God saw a place for him. That's interesting. Where I would have voted him down and said, not a man who gave in that easily. He's not a decent leader, and yet God had a place for him. God knew something that I don't know. God saw a place for him. He's going to be worth something, and he is going to be useful in the kingdom, and he is. Let's get one more. Nobody? I see people growing impatient with God. Look at chapter 31 and in verse 32 rather, in verse 2, 1 and 2. As for this Moses, we don't know what's becoming. It hadn't been but 40 days. And we don't know what become of him. And we're ready to give up and get us another God. Notice they didn't ask for another prophet. They asked for another God. That's interesting. Where does Moses go? They gave up on God because Moses was gone so long. And that's interesting. Instead of giving up on Moses, they gave up on God. Can we stop, George? That's right. Good point. We'll stop there.